The early morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the loading dock of the warehouse. It was that time of day when the air is still crisp and holds the promise of heat to come. For most people, this hour was for sleeping, but for David, it was the start of another long shift. He pulled the heavy steel door of the shipping facility open, the metal hinges groaning in protest. The smell of cardboard, dust, and old pallet wood immediately filled his nose. It was a smell he had known for 20 years. It was the smell of his life. David was 42 years old, though he looked older. The years of heavy lifting had bowed his shoulders and etched deep lines into his forehead. His hands were rough, covered in calluses that felt like sandpaper. When he looked at his palms, he didn't see hands anymore, he saw tools. They were instruments for moving boxes, operating forklifts, and securing cargo. They were practical, strong hands. But they were not the hands of a star, or at least, that is what the world had told him his entire life. He walked to the back of the warehouse, where the morning assignments were usually posted. The building was enormous, filled with towers of inventory that reached all the way to the ceiling. The silence was heavy. It was the kind of silence that only exists in huge, empty spaces right before the chaos of the workday begins. David liked this time. He liked being the only one there. It was the only time he felt free to drop his guard. David made his way to the far corner of the warehouse, near the ventilation fans that hummed a low, steady B-flat note. This was his spot. He looked around instinctively, even though he knew he was alone. Satisfied, he closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dusty air, and then, he let it out. The sound that came out of him was not a grunt of effort or a sigh of exhaustion. It was a sound of pure, liquid gold. It was a rich, deep baritone that seemed to vibrate the very air around him. He started with a simple scale, letting the notes roll out of his throat like water flowing over smooth stones. Do, re, mi, fa, sol. The notes hung in the air, perfect and precise. He didn't sing loud at first. He sang to the cardboard boxes stacked around him. He sang to the forklift parked in the corner. He sang because if he didn't, he felt like he might burst open. Inside his rough, weary exterior, there was a storm of feelings constantly raging. There was worry, there was fear, and there was a love so big it scared him. Singing was the only way to let a little bit of that pressure out. As he warmed up, his voice grew stronger. He moved from scales to a melody. It was an old song, one his mother used to hum to him when he was a child. He didn't know the technical name for it, but he knew every curve of the melody. In that empty warehouse, his voice transformed. The acoustics were surprisingly good. The sound bounced off the concrete floor and the metal walls, creating a natural echo that made him sound like he was performing in a grand hall. For 10 minutes, David was not a warehouse worker. He wasn't a tired father trying to keep the lights on. He was an artist. He felt a sense of peace wash over him that he couldn't find anywhere else. The ache in his lower back faded into the background. The stress of the upcoming bills disappeared. There was only the music. But the real world has a way of breaking in, usually with a harsh and jagged edge. The sound of the heavy metal garage door rolling up shattered the moment. David cut off the note in mid-air, snapping his mouth shut so quickly his teeth clicked together. The silence rushed back in, but now it felt awkward and exposed. He turned around to see the morning crew walking in. There was laughter and the sound of work boots scuffing against the concrete. Leading the group was a younger man named Tom. Tom was in his 20s, fit and energetic, with a loud voice and an even louder laugh. He was the kind of guy who was always the center of attention, the one who knew all the jokes and had the newest phone. Tom walked with a bounce in his step that David had lost decades ago. "Morning, Dave," Tom shouted, his voice echoing too loudly in the quiet space. "You talking to the boxes again, or was that a moan of pain?" A few of the other guys chuckled. They didn't mean to be cruel, really. It was just how they talked to each other on the floor. You teased, you joked, you kept things light because the work was hard. But for David, it felt like a stone dropped into a pond. The ripples of shame spread out instantly. "Just stretching," David mumbled, turning his back to them to grab a pallet jack. He felt his face getting hot. He hated that they could make him feel so small so easily. "Sounded like a dying cat to me," another worker called out from behind a stack of shelves. "Maybe stick to lifting, Dave. Leave the singing to the radio." The laughter grew a bit louder. David forced a smile, a tight, uncomfortable expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, you're probably right," he said, keeping his head down. He busied himself with checking the wheels on the pallet jack, kicking the tires to see if they held air. He could feel their eyes on him. He knew what they were thinking. They were looking at his stained work shirt, his greasy pants, and his receding hairline. They saw a middle-aged man with a dead-end job. They didn't see the music. They never saw the music. As the morning shift kicked into gear, the warehouse filled with the noise of machinery. Forklifts beeped as they backed up. Wrapping machines whirred. The huge fans spun overhead, drowning out any thought or feeling. David fell into the rhythm of the work. He moved box after box, loading them onto trucks with mechanical efficiency. His body moved on autopilot while his mind retreated to a safe place. He thought about his daughter, Lily. Lily was 7 years old. She had the biggest, brightest brown eyes you had ever seen. She was smart and funny and loved to draw pictures with crayons that she left all over the kitchen table. But Lily couldn't hear him. She had been born with severe hearing loss. The doctors called it profound. David called it a wall of glass. He could stand right in front of her and shout, and she wouldn't flinch. She lived in a world of silence. David had learned sign language just for her. He spent nights watching videos, practicing his hand shapes until his fingers cramped. He wanted to be able to talk to her, to tell her he loved her, to warn her about danger. But sometimes, signing wasn't enough. Sometimes, late at night, when Lily was having trouble sleeping, David would sit on the edge of her bed. The room would be dark, illuminated only by a night light shaped like a star. He would sign a story to her, his hands dancing in the dim light. But then, he would start to hum. He knew she couldn't hear the melody. He knew the words were lost to her. But he also knew that sound is physical. Sound is vibration. He would sing softly, a low rumble in his chest, and place his hand gently on her mattress or sometimes on her back. He could feel the music traveling through his body, into hers. He imagined the notes wrapping around her like a warm blanket. He sang lullabies that no one else ever heard. He sang songs about brave knights and gentle rivers. He sang to let her know that even though the world was quiet, it was full of love. And when he sang, Lily would relax. Her breathing would slow down. She would reach out in her sleep and grab his rough, calloused finger, holding on tight. That connection was the most important thing in David's life. It was the reason he got out of bed every morning. It was the reason he endured the back pain and the teasing and the long, hot days in the warehouse. But lately, the singing wasn't enough to keep the fear away. The bills were piling up. The insurance company had sent a letter last week saying they wouldn't cover the new hearing aids the doctor recommended for Lily. They were expensive, terribly expensive. David had looked at the number on the paper and felt his stomach drop. It was more than he made in 6 months. He had sat at the kitchen table that night, surrounded by unpaid bills, with his head in his hands. He felt like he was drowning. He worked hard. He never missed a day. But it was never enough. How could he give his daughter the world when he couldn't even afford to buy her the sound of it? Then he saw it. An advertisement on the TV in the break room. It was a commercial for a national talent competition. The Golden Voice, it was called. The screen flashed images of ordinary people standing on a shiny stage, holding a microphone, while a panel of judges watched with awe. Then came the words that made David's heart skip a beat: grand prize, $100,000. $100,000. The number spun around in David's head. It was a fantasy. It was a dream. It was impossible. He was just a guy from the warehouse. He didn't have a flashy outfit. He didn't have a backstory of tragedy or triumph that TV producers would like. He was just David. But as he loaded another heavy box onto the truck, he hummed a quiet note under his breath. He felt the vibration in his chest. He thought about Lily smiling at him, her eyes lighting up when he signed good morning. He looked over at Tom, who was joking loudly with the supervisor. David knew if he told them he was thinking about auditioning, they would laugh until they cried. They would mock him mercilessly. The thought made him want to crawl into a hole. But then, he thought about the letter from the insurance company. He thought about the look on the doctor's face when he said Lily needed these new devices to have a chance at normal speech development. David tightened his grip on the box. He wasn't doing this for fame. He wasn't doing this to prove Tom wrong. He was doing it because he was a father, and fathers do whatever it takes. Even if it means walking into a room full of strangers and opening yourself up to be judged. The shift ended. The whistle blew. David clocked out, his time card punching out with a loud thud. He walked to his car, an old sedan with a dent in the fender and a muffler that rattled. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just holding the steering wheel. The auditions were in 2 days. They were being held in the city, a 2-hour drive away. He would have to request the time off. He would have to find something to wear. He would have to find the courage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled flyer he had torn out of a newspaper in the break room. It was the same picture from the TV commercial. Do you have what it takes? Come audition. David looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He saw the tired eyes. He saw the gray stubble. He didn't see a star. But he took a deep breath, and in the quiet confines of his car, he sang a single, high note. It was clear and strong. It was a sound that belonged in a concert hall, not a loading dock. He started the engine. It sputtered and roared to life. He put the car in gear. He was terrified. He was absolutely terrified. But he was going to go. The drive to the city felt much longer than the 2 hours it actually took. David kept both hands tight on the steering wheel of his old sedan, the only sounds being the rattling of the engine and the hum of the tires on the highway. Beside him on the passenger seat lay his lucky shirt, a simple, dark blue button-up he had bought years ago for a wedding. It was a little faded and the collar was stiff, but it was the nicest thing he owned. He had ironed it that morning until the wrinkles were gone, trying to smooth out the imperfections just like he was trying to smooth out his nerves. When he finally arrived at the convention center where the auditions were being held, the size of the crowd took his breath away. There were hundreds, maybe thousands, of people. They were spilling out of the building and onto the sidewalk. David parked his car 3 blocks away, feeling a pit form in his stomach. As he walked toward the entrance, he felt like he was stepping into a different world. The people around him looked like they were ready for a magazine cover. There were groups of young women with perfect hair and sparkling dresses, practicing their dance moves on the sidewalk. There were young men with stylish haircuts and leather jackets tuning electric guitars. Everyone seemed to shine with a certain kind of confidence. They looked like stars. David looked down at his own scuffed work boots and felt the urge to turn around and get back in his car. He felt like a fraud, an intruder who had wandered into a party where he wasn't invited. He joined the line, shuffling forward slowly under the bright sun. The air was filled with the noise of people warming up their voices, scales, trills, and high-pitched squeaks, and the chatter of excitement. David stood silently, clutching his laminated number card so hard his knuckles turned white. In front of him was a trio of young men. They looked like a boy band. They had matching white outfits and perfectly styled hair. They were laughing loudly, looking at their phones, and joking with the girls around them. At one point, one of them turned around and bumped into David. "Whoa, sorry man," the young guy said. He looked David up and down, his eyes lingering on David's worn-out boots and the slightly frayed cuffs of his pants. A smirk flickered across the guy's face, quickly hidden by a polite smile. "Big crowd today, good luck out there." "Thanks," David mumbled, looking at his shoes. He knew that look. It was the look people gave when they felt sorry for you, or worse, when they felt better than you. The guy turned back to his friends, and David heard a snort of laughter. He didn't know what they were saying, but he could feel the judgment radiating off them. He was just the warehouse worker to them. A background character in their movie. The line moved inch by inch. The sun climbed higher, making the air hot and heavy. David wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He thought about Lily. He thought about the quiet way she signed "I love you" that morning before he left. That was why he was here. He wasn't here to make friends with the pop stars. He was here for her. He repeated that mantra in his head, pushing down the shame that tried to climb up his throat. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the front doors. The atmosphere inside was even more intense. It was a massive hall filled with rows of chairs, bright stage lights, and a sense of nervous energy that you could almost taste. Staff members with headsets and clipboards rushed around, shouting instructions. David was directed to a holding area with a group of other contestants. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched as people were called up one by one or in groups. Some came back beaming with joy, clutching a golden ticket that meant they were through to the next round. Others came back with tears in their eyes, shaking their heads, their dreams crushed in a matter of minutes. Finally, a woman with a headset shouted, "Group 4B, you're up. Follow me." David stood up. His legs felt like they were made of lead. He walked with the group down a long, narrow corridor that led to the side of the stage. The air grew cooler as they got closer to the main auditorium. He could hear the muffled sounds of the judges' voices and the applause or booing of the audience. The stage manager stopped them at a black velvet curtain. "Okay, listen up," the manager said briskly. "When your name is called, walk to the mark on the floor. State your name and what you're singing. Don't speak until spoken to. And remember, you have 30 seconds to impress us. Good luck." David swallowed hard. 30 seconds. That was all the time he had to change his life. He adjusted his collar, suddenly feeling like it was choking him. The group ahead of them finished their performance and walked past, some looking shaken. The stage manager signaled for David's group to go. The bright lights hit him like a physical blow. As he walked out onto the stage, he couldn't see the audience at all. The lights were blinding, creating a wall of white. He could only see the silhouettes of the judges' table in the distance. He walked to the black X marked on the floor and stood on it. He felt small and exposed. The silence in the room was heavy. Thousands of people were sitting out there in the dark, watching him. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back. He gripped the microphone stand with both hands to stop them from shaking. Center stage sat the judges. There was the famous producer known for his harsh critiques, the pop star with the glittery dress, and the older musician who was known for being kind. But it was the producer, a man with sharp glasses and a sneer, who leaned forward first. "What's your name, buddy?" the producer asked. He didn't look at David, he was looking at his paperwork, bored already. "David," he said, his voice trembling slightly. It sounded weak over the big speakers. "David. I live in the city. I work in a warehouse." The producer looked up then. He raised an eyebrow. "A warehouse like, moving boxes?" "Yes, sir. Shipping and receiving." The producer let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed through the speakers. "Well, let's hope you handle melodies better than you handle heavy machinery. What are you going to sing for us?" David felt a wave of heat wash over his face. The audience tittered. It was a polite laugh, but it stung. He was a joke to them. Just a source of quick entertainment before the next pop star came out. "I'm going to sing an old folk song," David said quietly. It's about watching someone you love grow." The pop star judge sighed loudly and checked her watch. "Okay, David. Whenever you're ready. Please make it interesting." David closed his eyes for a second. He needed to block them out. He needed to be back in the warehouse, or better yet, in Lily's room. He took a breath, but before he could sing, the harsh judge spoke again. "Actually, hold on," the judge said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look at us, David. Don't close your eyes. We want to see the passion. Show us you want this." David opened his eyes. The glare from the lights was painful. He blinked rapidly. The judge waved a hand dismissively. "You know what, just start. The clock is ticking." David signaled to the sound engineer. He had requested a simple acoustic guitar track. He waited for the music to start. The intro began, a soft, gentle strumming. But the volume was too low. He could barely hear it. He looked at the sound booth in panic, but the judge shook his head. "Stop, stop," the judge said. The music cut out abruptly. "This isn't working. I can already tell where this is going. It's going to be slow, it's going to be boring, and quite frankly, I don't have the patience for another sad warehouse worker singing a sad song." The audience laughed again. It was louder this time. It wasn't just a titter, it was a roar of amusement. They were enjoying the show, but not in the way David had hoped. "Look at you," the judge continued, leaning back in his chair. "You look like you just came off a 10-hour shift. Where's the energy, where's the spark? You're just a regular guy. This is a competition for stars." David felt his knees shaking. He wanted to run. He wanted to jump off the stage and run all the way back to his car. The humiliation was crushing. He felt small, dirty, and stupid for thinking he could ever belong here. The other judges stayed silent, letting their colleague tear him down. The pop star judge was looking at her nails. "Give us one note," the judge challenged, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Just one good note, and I won't cut the mic. But if it's bad and it looks like it will be, just walk off. Save us the time." The audience went silent, waiting for the disaster. David looked at the sea of darkness. He couldn't see faces, but he could feel the judgment. It was a heavy weight pressing down on his shoulders. He felt the roughness of his hands against the smooth metal of the microphone. He thought about his boots, his dusty apartment, and the stack of bills on his kitchen table. He looked at the judge who had mocked him. The man was smiling, waiting for a failure. Something inside David shifted. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was a realization. He realized that he had nothing left to lose. He had already been mocked. He had already been dismissed. He was already a joke in their eyes. The only thing he had left was his voice, and the truth inside it. He didn't nod at the judge. He didn't acknowledge the request. He just closed his eyes, shutting out the lights, the judges, and the laughter. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs until his chest puffed out against his tight shirt. He didn't wait for the music. He didn't need it. He opened his mouth, and the sound that came out was not a plea for approval. It was a declaration. The first note didn't just leave his mouth, it seemed to tear out of him. It was a low, chest rumbling sound that bypassed the microphones and the speakers and vibrated straight through the floorboards of the stage. It was a sound of pure force, like a deep bell tolling in a valley. The judge who had been smirking, the one with the sharp glasses, froze. His hand was still half raised in a gesture of dismissal, but the sneer vanished from his face instantly. The sarcastic comment he had been ready to deliver died in his throat. He sat back in his chair, his eyes widening in surprise. David kept his eyes squeezed shut. He was no longer in the auditorium. He wasn't on a stage with blinding lights. He was back in his small, dim living room. He was watching Lily sit at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to color inside the lines of a dinosaur drawing. He was remembering the way the morning light caught the dust motes dancing around her head. Because the band had stopped playing, David had to find his own rhythm. He didn't have a drum beat or a guitar strum to hold onto. He only had the silence and the steady beat of his own heart. He tapped his foot once, a heavy thud against the stage floor, and let the second note follow. The song was an old folk tune, simple and sad. It told the story of a tree that stands alone in a field, watching the seasons change. It wasn't a song about hitting high notes or showing off vocal runs. It was a song about endurance. It was about staying rooted when the wind blows hard. As he sang the opening lines, his voice cracked. It wasn't because he couldn't hit the note. It was because the emotion was too big for his throat. The crack in his voice sounded like a branch breaking under the weight of snow. It was raw. It was imperfect. And it was absolutely terrifying for him to let it out. Usually, when people audition for these shows, they try to hide their flaws. They smile and dress up and pretend everything is perfect. But David couldn't pretend. He was tired. He was worried about money. He was terrified that he wasn't enough for his daughter. All of that poured into the song. The lyrics spoke of watching a child grow up, of the fear that the world is too cold for them. The winter comes and the leaves fall down, David sang, his voice gaining strength, swelling like a rising tide. but the roots go deep into the ground. In the control booth above the stage, the sound engineer stared at his monitors. He was used to adjusting levels, fixing pitch, and adding reverb to make contestants sound better. But he didn't touch a single slider. The voice coming through the headphones was so clear and so present that it didn't need any help. It filled the frequency spectrum, rich and warm. The engineer leaned back in his chair, forgetting to breathe. On the stage, David's hands were gripped so tightly around the microphone stand that his knuckles were white. He swayed slightly, not because he was dancing, but because the music was moving him. He was no longer standing, he was floating in the melody. He reached the chorus. This was the part where the song usually got louder, where a drum kit would kick in. But since there was no band, David had to provide all the power himself. He took a massive breath, his chest expanding until the buttons of his shirt strained. "And I will stand, and I will stay." His voice soared. It wasn't a scream. It was a powerful, resonant shout that sounded like a plea to the heavens. The acoustics of the massive hall caught the sound and threw it back, amplifying it until the very air in the room seemed to hum. The people sitting in the back rows, who had been chatting and eating popcorn only moments ago, stopped chewing. They stopped moving. The sound washed over them, silencing the whispers. The pop star judge, the one who had been looking at her nails, slowly lowered her hand. She turned her head toward the stage, a look of genuine confusion on her face. She had heard thousands of singers in her career. She knew technical perfection. She knew auto-tune and backup tracks. But this was different. This was a voice that had lived. This was a voice that had known hard work and sorrow. David couldn't see any of this. His eyes were still shut tight. Inside his head, the images were flashing faster. He saw the hospital room where Lily was born. He saw the doctor's mouth moving silently, giving the news about her hearing. He remembered the feeling of his heart breaking, shattering into a million pieces on the sterile floor. And then he remembered the feeling of picking up those pieces and gluing them back together with love. He sang the pain of that moment, but he also sang the love. He sang the way it felt to hold her for the first time, to promise her that he would always be her tree, always be her shelter. The melody became a lullaby, fierce and protective. The cynical judge was now sitting forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He wasn't looking at his paperwork anymore. He was staring at David, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a ghost, or perhaps a miracle. The mockery was gone, replaced by a strange kind of awe. He realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had judged a book by its cover, and the story inside was turning out to be a masterpiece. David sang the final verse. His voice began to soften, descending from the powerful heights back down to the deep, rumbling bass where he started. The transition was seamless, like a bird gliding down to its nest. So when the wind is cold and strong. His voice dropped to a whisper now. The audience had to lean in to hear him. The huge room was deadly silent. Thousands of people were holding their breath, afraid that if they made a sound, the magic would break. There was no coughing, no rustling of snacks, no whispering. There was only David. "You know exactly where you belong." He held the last note. It was a long, sustained tone that started strong and slowly faded into nothingness, like the last light of the day fading into the night. He didn't cut it off abruptly, he let it dissolve naturally until there was no sound left in his lungs. David stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, his eyes still closed. He was afraid to open them. He was afraid that if he did, he would see the laughter again. He was afraid that he would see the judge waving his hand, telling him to get lost. For those few seconds while he sang, he had been able to escape his reality. But now, the silence of the room brought the reality rushing back. He slowly opened his eyes. The bright lights made him blink. He couldn't see the audience clearly, but he could feel that the atmosphere had changed completely. The air didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt heavy, charged with something he couldn't name. He looked at the judges. The mean judge wasn't smiling. He wasn't sneering. He was just looking at David with a completely blank expression, as if his brain was trying to process what he had just heard. The pop star judge had tears in her eyes. She was blinking rapidly, trying to keep them from falling, but one escaped and rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand, embarrassed by her own emotion. The third judge, the older musician, had taken off his glasses. He was rubbing his eyes, exhausted by the beauty of what he had just heard. David stood there, feeling small and exposed again. He waited for the verdict. In his head, he was already packing his bags. He was thinking about the long drive home. He was thinking about how he would explain to Lily that he didn't win the money for her hearing aids. He would tell her he tried, and that would have to be enough. The silence stretched on. It lasted 5 seconds. Then 10. It felt like an hour. The microphone in David's hand gave a little squeal of feedback, making him flinch. He looked down at his boots. He had done it. He had sung his heart out. He had poured his soul onto the stage, and for a few minutes, he had felt like a giant. Now, he just felt tired. He let go of the microphone stand. His hands were trembling again, but this time it was from the adrenaline leaving his body. He took a step back, preparing to turn around and walk off the stage. He assumed they would cut to a commercial break or buzz him out now that the song was over. He didn't expect a parade. He just didn't want to be laughed at anymore. But as he turned his head toward the exit, a sound started to rise from the darkness. It wasn't a boo. It wasn't a murmur. It was the sound of one person clapping. Then 2. Then 100. David stopped. He turned back to the judges, confused. He didn't understand. He had braced himself for rejection, but the world had shifted under his feet while his eyes were closed. The cynical judge, the one who had mocked him, slowly stood up. He didn't say a word. He just looked at David, nodded his head once, a deep, respectful nod, and began to clap. The sound started as a ripple, like the first drop of rain hitting a still pond, but within seconds, it grew into a deafening roar. The audience was on its feet. Thousands of people were clapping, cheering, and whistling. The noise was so loud that it vibrated in David's chest. He stood frozen on the black X mark, his hands hanging limp at his sides. He looked out into the glare of the lights, trying to see their faces, but he could only see a wall of brightness. The energy coming from the darkness was overwhelming. It wasn't just polite applause, it was a wave of shock and awe. David felt dizzy. He had expected mocking laughter. He had expected to be buzzed off the stage in 10 seconds. Instead, the very people who had been silent, or perhaps laughing at his appearance just moments ago, were now screaming his name. The young man in the white outfit, the one from the waiting room who had bumped into him, was somewhere out there. David wondered if he was clapping too. On the judges' panel, the mood had shifted drastically. The harsh judge, the one with the sharp glasses, was still standing. He wasn't clapping wildly like the crowd, but he was nodding slowly. His smirk was long gone, replaced by a look of serious contemplation. He looked at David not as a peasant who had wandered into the palace, but as a man who had just proven that kings don't need crowns. The pop star judge was wiping her eyes again. She leaned over to the older musician judge and whispered something, but she didn't need a microphone for her emotions to be clear. She was visibly moved. The older musician simply sat there, beaming, a grandfatherly smile of pure pride on his face. He looked as if he had been waiting his whole life to hear a voice that real. The host of the show, a man with perfect teeth and a shiny suit, walked onto the stage. He usually rushed through these moments, keeping the energy high and the jokes flowing. But this time, he walked slowly. He approached David not as a presenter talking to a contestant, but with the respect one might give to a veteran or a teacher. The host put a hand on David's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "David," the host said into his own microphone, his voice echoing through the now quieting room. "David, take a breath. I think you broke us a little bit." The audience laughed softly, a warm and affectionate sound. David let out a nervous breath he felt like he'd been holding for years. He managed a weak, awkward smile. He still felt out of place in his old clothes, but the hostility in the air had completely vanished. It had been replaced by curiosity and warmth. I didn't mean to make anyone cry," David said into the microphone, his voice raspy and unsure. He spoke simply, without trying to be charming or witty. "I just wanted to sing." The harsh judge picked up his microphone. The room went silent instantly, everyone wanted to know what he would say. He had a reputation for destroying dreams. If he approved, it meant more than anyone else's words. "David," the judge began, his voice unusually soft. "I have been doing this for a long time. I hear thousands of voices every year. Most of them are technically perfect. They hit every note, they know all the runs, they look like stars." He paused, looking down at his papers for a second, then back up at David. "But in the last 20 years, I have rarely heard truth like that." The audience cheered again. "You came out here," the judge continued, "and I judged you. I judged your clothes. I judged your job. I judged you before you even opened your mouth. And that was my mistake. Because when you sang, you didn't sing notes. You sang your life. You stripped yourself bare in front of millions of people. That is the rarest thing in the world. And I am sorry for what I said earlier." David felt a lump form in his throat. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. An apology from that man was worth more than any trophy. The pop star judge spoke next. "David, that song, it felt like you were singing directly to my soul. I don't know who you were singing to, but I envy them. To be loved that purely, it's a gift. Your voice is beautiful, but your heart is even more beautiful." David looked down at his boots. He thought about Lily. He thought about how she couldn't hear these words. She couldn't hear the applause or the judges telling him he was wonderful. It hurt for a split second, a sharp pang in his heart. But then he realized that the feelings in the room weren't just about sound. They were about connection. He had connected with these people. He had made them feel something. And that was what he did for Lily every night. He made her feel the love, even if she couldn't hear the words. "Thank you," David whispered into the mic. "I was singing for my daughter." The room awed in unison. It was a collective sound of tenderness. "Is she here?" the host asked. "No," David shook his head. "She's at home. She's deaf. She can't hear me sing." The silence that fell over the auditorium this time was different from the shocked silence before. This was a holy silence. It was heavy with empathy. The revelation that this man, who possessed such a powerful instrument, used it to serenade a child who lived in silence, was almost too much for the audience to process. The narrative had flipped completely. In a matter of minutes, David had gone from a joke to a tragic hero to an inspiration. The older musician judge leaned forward. He spoke with a gravelly, wise tone. You know, David, music isn't just about what hits the eardrums. It's about vibration. It's about intent. And I have a feeling your daughter hears you better than anyone else ever could. David felt the tears finally spill over. He didn't wipe them away. He just let them run down his rough cheeks. He felt seen. He felt understood. For years, he had felt invisible in his life, just a worker moving boxes in the dark. Now, he was standing in the light, and his struggles were being honored, not mocked. The host looked at the judges for the final verdict. Well, I think we know what the vote is going to be, he said, smiling at David. But we need to hear it. The harsh judge looked at David, then pressed the large golden button in front of him. The stage lit up with golden lights. A siren sound effect blared through the speakers, signaling a yes. The pop star judge pressed hers. Absolutely yes. The older musician pressed his. 100% yes. The confetti cannons shot out from the sides of the stage, filling the air with streams of gold and silver paper. The band, who had been silent the whole time, struck up a triumphant chord. The music was celebratory, loud, and happy. David looked around him, the colored paper falling like snow. He laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh. He couldn't believe it. He had done it. He was going through. He was going to the next round. The host guided him toward the back of the stage to do the post-performance interview, the coronation walk. As David walked, the crowd reached out. Hundreds of hands stretched toward the stage, people wanting to touch his hand, wanting to be part of this moment. He reached down and shook a few hands, his rough palm meeting soft, excited strangers. He looked into the faces of the people in the front row. They were crying, they were smiling, they were shouting encouragement. He saw a young girl holding a sign that said, "You have a voice." She was jumping up and down, waving at him. David smiled at her and gave a little wave. It was a surreal moment. He was the same person he was when he woke up that morning, tired, broke, and worried, but the world saw him differently now. They walked off the stage and into the wings. The instant he was out of the bright lights, the adrenaline that had been keeping him upright began to fade. His legs felt like jelly. A stagehand with a headset ran up to him, handing him a bottle of water. "You were amazing, man," the stagehand said, his eyes wide. "Seriously. I've never seen anything like that." David took the water, his hand shaking so much the water sloshed out of the bottle. "Thank you," he said. He took a long drink. The water was cool and refreshing. He was led to a small room backstage where the families of the contestants usually waited. It was empty, of course. David sat down on a folding chair. He put his head in his hands. The reality of what just happened washed over him. He had survived. He had conquered. But more than that, he had changed the story. A few minutes later, the door opened. It was the harsh judge. He didn't have his microphone. He wasn't wearing his TV face. He just looked like a tired man in a suit. "David," the judge said, stepping into the room. He closed the door behind him, giving them a moment of privacy. David stood up quickly. "Sir. I just wanted to tell you something off the record," the judge said. He walked over and stood in front of David. He looked uncomfortable, as if he wasn't used to being vulnerable. "I lost my brother a few years ago. I was hard on him. I didn't listen to him. When you sang, it reminded me of him. It reminded me of what I missed." David didn't know what to say. He just nodded. "Don't lose that," the judge said, pointing a finger at David's chest. "Don't let this business change you. You have something that money can't buy. You have truth. Protect that." With that, the judge turned and walked out. David stood there alone in the small room. He looked at his reflection in the mirror on the wall. His hair was messy. His eyes were red. His shirt was sticking to him with sweat. But for the first time in a long time, he liked what he saw. He wasn't just a warehouse worker anymore. He wasn't just a struggling father. He was David, the man with the golden voice. He sat back down and pulled his phone out of his pocket. He had a dozen text messages from co-workers asking if he was okay. He didn't answer them. Instead, he opened the camera app and recorded a short video. "Hey Lily," he whispered into the phone, holding it up so she could see his face, which was flushed and happy. "I did it, baby. I sang for you. And they liked it. I'm coming home. And I think we're going to be okay." He stopped the recording and stared at the screen for a long time. He thought about the money. He thought about the hearing aids. He thought about the future. It wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time, the door was open. And he was the one who had kicked it down. The weeks that followed the audition felt like a blur to David. His life, which had once been a predictable routine of forklifts and cardboard boxes, had turned into a whirlwind of cameras, interviews, and new clothes. The producers of the show had decided that David's story was too good to be true, and they were determined to make him the star of the season. They gave him a stylist who tried to put him in tight leather jackets and flashy boots, but David refused. He agreed to wear nicer slacks and a clean shirt, but he drew the line at changing who he was. He wasn't a pop star, and he didn't want to pretend to be one. Every night, he sat in his hotel room and called Lily. He would hold the phone up to the camera and sign to her, telling her about the lights, the other contestants, and the food. She would watch him with wide eyes, her face lighting up every time she saw him. She couldn't hear the buzz of the city outside his window or the noise of the production crew, but she could see the excitement in his hands. The competition was fierce. There were young singers who could dance and hit notes so high they seemed to shatter glass. There were bands with elaborate setups and solo acts with sob stories that made the audience weep. But every time David walked onto the stage, the room changed. He didn't have the best technique. He didn't have the flashiest moves. But he had that voice, that deep, resonant, honest voice that seemed to speak directly to the heart. He made it through the semifinals. Then the quarterfinals. Each week, the harsh judge defended him against critics who said he was boring. "He isn't boring," the judge would say, his voice firm. "He is real. And in a world of plastic, real is rare." Finally, the night of the finale arrived. The arena was packed. There were thousands of people in the audience, and millions more watching at home on their televisions. The air inside the massive hall was thick with tension and excitement. Balloons and confetti cannons were poised in the rafters, ready to celebrate the winner. David stood in the wings, watching the last performer finish a high-energy dance number. The crowd went wild. The young performer was incredible, talented beyond his years. David took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He wasn't singing a folk song this time. The producers had asked him to sing something original, something that told his story. He walked out onto the stage. The lights were blinding, even brighter than before. He could feel the heat of them on his face. He stood on his mark and looked out into the sea of darkness. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. He could feel the weight of their expectations. He wasn't holding a microphone stand this time. He held the mic in his hand, his grip tight. The music started. It was a simple piano melody, slow and melancholy. David closed his eyes. He didn't sing the first verse right away. He let the piano play, letting the mood settle over the room. Then, he began to sing. He sang about the morning silence. He sang about the warehouse and the dust. He sang about the feeling of being invisible. But as the song built, his voice grew stronger. He sang about a little girl who lived in a quiet world. He sang about the love that doesn't need sound to exist. He sang about the vibration in his chest and the way her hand felt in his. The lyrics were simple, words he had written on a napkin in the hotel cafeteria. But when he sang them, they felt like poetry. He didn't try to impress the judges with runs or riffs. He just sang the truth. I don't need the world to hear my name, he sang, his voice soaring over the swelling strings of the orchestra. I just need to know that she feels the same. That when I hold her close and sing this tune, she knows she's safe beneath the moon. When he hit the final note, he didn't hold it for show. He let it fade gently, like a sigh. He opened his eyes and looked directly at the camera, knowing Lily was watching at home with her grandmother. He signed the words "I love you" to the lens. The arena exploded. It wasn't just applause, it was a catharsis. People were standing on their feet, screaming, crying, and clapping. The judges stood as one. The harsh judge was smiling broadly, clapping his hands above his head. The pop star judge had tears streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. David stood there, bathed in the golden light. He didn't feel like a celebrity. He felt like a father who had finally been able to give his daughter the world. The host came back out, his voice trembling with emotion. Ladies and gentlemen. David. The applause went on for so long that David had to wave his hands to quiet them down. He felt shy, uncomfortable with so much attention focused solely on him. Now, the host said, it is time to find out who our winner is. The tension in the room became palpable. David stood next to the other finalist, the young dancer. They shook hands. The young man smiled at David, a look of genuine respect on his face. The winner of the Golden Voice. The host paused, dragging out the moment for dramatic effect. He looked at the card in his hand. The winner is David. Confetti exploded from the ceiling. Gold and silver streamers rained down on the stage. The music swelled triumphant and loud. The young dancer hugged David, patting him on the back before stepping back to let him have his moment. David stood frozen for a second. It felt surreal. He looked at the heavy golden trophy in the host's hands as it was offered to him. It was shiny and heavy, representing everything he had ever wanted. He took the trophy and held it up. The crowd cheered louder. But David's mind was already miles away. He wasn't thinking about the recording contract. He wasn't thinking about the fame. He was thinking about the check. A few days later, David was back home. There was no parade, no press conference. He didn't want that. He asked the show's producers to keep the location of his house private. He just wanted to be a dad again. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had stared at the insurance rejection letter months ago. But today, there was no rejection letter. There was a check from the show, and a folder from a specialist clinic downtown. Lily came into the room. She was wearing her favorite pajamas with stars on them. She looked at David, her eyes curious. She sensed that something was different. She could see the excitement in his face. David signed to her. "Come here, sweetie." She climbed up onto his lap. She was getting big now, but she still fit perfectly in his arms. He looked at the folder. It contained the information for the new hearing aids. They weren't just hearing aids, they were advanced implants that could help her perceive sound in a way she never had before. They were expensive, more money than David would have made in 10 years at the warehouse. But now, they were hers. A week later, they sat in the doctor's office. The room was small and quiet. The doctor, a kind woman with gentle eyes, was adjusting the device behind Lily's ear. Lily sat still, looking at David with a mix of trust and confusion. David held her hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was more nervous now than he had been on the big stage. "Okay, David," the doctor said softly. "I'm going to turn it on now. Talk to her. Just normal speaking." David swallowed hard. He looked at his little girl. He squeezed her hand gently. "Lily," he said. He didn't sign it. He just spoke the word. Lily's eyes widened. She blinked rapidly. She turned her head, looking around the room, trying to find the source of the strange new sensation. She looked back at David. "Daddy," she whispered. Her voice was rough from lack of use, but it was the most beautiful sound David had ever heard. She had heard his voice. She had actually heard it. Tears spilled out of David's eyes. He didn't try to stop them. He laughed and cried at the same time, pulling her into a tight hug. "Yes, baby. It's Daddy. I'm here." Over the next few months, David's life settled into a new kind of normal. He didn't go back to the warehouse. He spent his time writing music and taking Lily to speech therapy. He recorded an album, just a simple collection of folk songs and lullabies. It didn't top the pop charts, but it sold steadily, and the people who bought it loved it. They said it made them feel less alone. One evening, a few months after the show ended, David was sitting in the living room. It was raining outside, a soft pitter-patter against the window. Lily was on the rug, playing with her toys. A radio was playing in the corner. Suddenly, Lily started to hum. It was a simple tune, off-key and stumbling. She was humming the song David had sung in the finale. She was matching the pitch of the radio.